is Pullen for Lesson 1.05 on Standard Deviation for AP Statistics. In this video, I'm going to go over Example 3 quickly, where we calculate the standard deviation of a data set manually, and Example 4, where we calculate the standard deviation of a data set using the calculator. So the formula for the sample standard deviation, which we represent by S of x, lowercase s of x, standing for sample standard deviation, is actually given to you on the AP exam. You will always be able to calculate the sample standard deviation using the calculator, but it's helpful to calculate it manually once so you get a better understanding of what the sample standard deviation represents. The sample standard deviation represents the average distance each data value is from the mean. When we look at the formula, the x minus x bar, that's each data value x minus the sample mean, gives you the distance. So here's my data set, which I listed in this column. It's from example 2. And the mean is actually of the sample x bar, that's how we represent the sample mean, is 41.5. So the first part of the formula, they said, take each data value x and subtract the sample mean of 41.5 from it. So 37 minus 41.5 is negative 4.5. 38 minus 41.5 is negative 3.5, and so forth. And we go through the whole column of numbers. When you take an average, you're summing all the values and dividing it by the total number. But if we sum the total values now, what would happen is those distances would cancel out and we wouldn't get a real average distance. So how do we account for the positive negative? What we do is we square that difference. So that's where in the formula it tells us to go ahead and take each data, that difference that we calculated from the column to the left, and we square it. This would end up giving us a positive number, a positive squared number, but it's positive. So negative 4.5 squared is 20.25, negative 3.5 squared is 12.25, and so forth. The next thing when you're taking an average, so we're going to take this average of this square difference, is you sum all the values and you divide it by the total number of values. So that sigma, if, for those of you who don't remember or have never seen it before, it's called a capital sigma. It's a Greek letter. It tells the person to sum. So we're going to sum this column, and when we do so, we get 88.5. So that 88.5 represents the sum of the square differences. So normally, when you're taking an average, you just divide by the total numbers. So normally, you would just divide by n representing, in this case, we have 10 data values. However, when you're finding the sample standard deviation, and you don't have to memorize this, the calculator does it automatically with the sample standard deviation, you actually divide it by n minus 1. So in this case, 10 minus 1. And this takes into, the reason for it is that you don't have the whole population and you don't want to underestimate the variation. So hold that. We're going to go more into that later on this year, but for now, understand that the calculator automatically does it. If you were finding the population standard deviation, it's pretty much the same formula, except you're dividing it by the total number. So that's for the population. But chances are you don't have the whole population, and so therefore you would divide it by n minus 1. So What you're actually doing is finding the variance, the average squared standard deviation, which is called the variance. And this is actually the sample variance because we're basing it on sample data. And so we're going to take the 88.5 and we're going to divide it by 9, or 10 minus 1. And when we do that, we get a value of 9.833. But remember, that represents the squared of these differences. So it's hard for us to compare and understand our data. So what you end up doing, the sample standard deviation is actually the square root of the sample variance. So you're actually going ahead and taking the square root of 9.833, which is 3.136. And so the average distance that each of these data values, the 37 through 47, is from the mean is about 3.14 points away. Okay. So hopefully that gives you like a better sense of, so this we got is 9.833, right? And then we took the square root of it to get the standard deviation. So this is the sample standard deviation. Okay. So now we want to do this in the calculator because this would take too much time, and that's the purpose of technology anyhow. So I'm going to go to my graphing calculator, and I'm going to show you how to do this. So you're going to go home, and you're going to start a new document. It's always good to start a new document. I was too fast. And I want to add a list in spreadsheet, item number 4. And you have to give it a variable, the column a variable name. So I'm going to call it X. You really can call it anything else. You don't want to use the row immediately below it. It's a formula row. We'll be using it a couple of times this year, but understand it's a formula row. Formulas like you would use in Excel and Google Sheet. And we're not going to use that right now. And we're going to type in the data from example 4A. So quickly type it in. You should be doing this along with me so you can get a better sense. So hopefully you have your calculator or put the video on hold and rewind to this point so you can do this along with me. And I better check my entry. So 15, 13, 13, 12, 10, 9, 8, 8, 7, 6, 4, 4, 3, 1. Okay, excellent. The next thing we want to do is attach a calculator page to our data set. To do that, you're going to hit Control Doc. Do you see where it says plus page? So we're adding an attachment to this. So we're going to be using this feature a lot. So I'm adding a calculator. So my data is in 1.1. My calculator page is 1.2. You're then going to hit Menu because the calculator is menu driven. And we're mostly going to be in the statistics menu the whole year. So do you see the X bar? So you're going to hit 6. And you want to do the stack summary statistics are in 1. So let me just go back a second. So it's in item 1. Now, there's a whole bunch of options. For this unit, we're going to use option 1, one variable statistics. We're in univariate data. We only have one list. We hit OK. And then we start going ahead and we want to use the drop-down menu, or if you recall your variable name, I'm going to use the drop-down menu. You would enter it there. We don't have a frequency list. I'll show you that tomorrow. And we don't have a category list. That's when you want to get fancy. You use those last 2 options. And you hit OK. And so this is the output. It's that quick, certainly better than doing it manually. So the sample mean is 8.071. And again, we represent the sample mean by X bar. You don't need to use those two options, the next two options. That just represents the sum of the x's and the sum of the x squareds. The SX represents the sample standard deviation. That's when you only have a sample, the data from a sample and not the whole population. And this is lowercase, below it is lowercase sigma x, and that represents the population standard deviation. N is our sample size of 14. They give you the minimum value, and look, you don't even have to calculate the quartiles. They do it for you. So the quartile 1 is 4, the median is 8, quartile 3 is 12, and the maximum value is 15. And so I'm just going to record the information here. So X bar, again, represents our sample mean of 8.071. You should get into the habit of carrying out to 3 places. S of X, the sample standard deviation, is 4.215. Sigma X, we don't need because we only have a sample. They didn't say the entire population. The range is max minus min, so it's 15 minus 1 or 14. And the IQR is Q3, quartile 3 minus quartile 1. And remember, they gave you those information, so you easily can calculate this using the calculator in seconds. Okay, put the video on hold and try example B. When you're ready, come back. So to start a new document, it's a good idea to always start a new document. So I'm going to go home and press 1, new document, and don't save it. You're going to add a list and spreadsheet. That's how you enter the data. And you're going to head the row. Okay. The next thing you're going to do is quickly type in the numbers. Okay, so once you edit the data, again, you hit Control Page, add a calculator page, menu, statistics, stack calculations, whoop, went too fast, menu, statistics, stack calculations, we're dealing with one variable, univariate data. We have one list, and we hit the drop-down menu. We don't have a frequency list, and we hit OK. And you should have a sample mean of 277.889. You should have a sample standard deviation of 26.122. Okay, and we'll write down the other information in a second. So X bar is 277.889. The sample standard deviation represented by X subscript X is 26.122. The range is the max minus the minimum, 312 minus 235 or 77. The IQR is 299, that's quartile 3.5 minus 253 or 46.5. I hope this video was helpful.